The Pembroke Grounds were cloaked in a golden haze that afternoon, the soft hum of voices fading as the announcer's voice crackled through the speakers. A hush settled over the grandstands as the next competitor was called, Beatrice Langley, a rising name in the junior equestrian circuit. At just 15, she carried herself with the quiet composure of someone far older. She entered the arena atop her striking chestnut gelding, Winston, his polished bridle gleaming under the sun, his hooves tapping with restrained power. Beatrice's expression was unreadable, focused, almost solemn. To the crowd, it was the look of determination. To those who knew her story, it was something deeper. This wasn't just a competition. It was the anniversary of her father's passing. 5 years ago, he'd been found lifeless in the stables at their countryside home. Since then, riding had been more than a sport. It was her link to the man who once whispered to horses as if they understood English. Winston had been her father's last chosen foal, and somehow the horse seemed to carry a piece of him in his soul. Samuel Carow, her trainer, stood quietly by the arena gate, arms crossed tightly over his tweed jacket. A man of few words and fewer smiles, Samuel had taken Beatrice under his wing when most other trainers wouldn't touch her, too emotionally unstable for competition, they said. But Samuel saw something in her. A quiet storm. That same kind of storm her father once carried behind his eyes. And now, here she was, poised and ready, under the judging eyes of Pembroke's most traditional panel. The first half of the routine was flawless. Winston responded to every cue with fluidity and power. Beatrice's posture, timing, and touch were nearly perfect. The audience leaned forward, captivated by the harmony between horse and rider, a seamless flow that bordered on the poetic. But as they approached the final turn, everything changed in a blink. Beatrice's left stirrup slipped. Her knee jolted forward. Her balance tipped. And then she fell. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Her body hit the ground with a thud that echoed, her helmet tilting slightly on impact. She lay there, stunned, pain shooting from her hip. Officials began to move, but Winston didn't bolt. He stopped immediately, turned, and walked slowly back toward her. With careful steps, he lowered his head and nudged her shoulder, not out of confusion, but tenderness. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the great gelding knelt, resting one leg as if to be closer to her. Beatrice's eyes welled as her hand touched his muzzle. It wasn't just a fall, it was a memory rising from the earth beneath her. Something about the way Winston looked at her, how he moved toward her, stirred something old and buried. As the paramedics approached, Beatrice whispered, "He knew." What Winston knew, and how, would come to unravel everything she thought she understood about her father, and about herself. The medical tent at Pembroke Grounds was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of fabric and the low hum of voices outside. Beatrice sat on the edge of a folding cot, her right hip wrapped in a cold compress. Her face was pale, not from the pain, though it was certainly there, but from something less visible. Her gaze was unfocused, locked on a point just beyond the tent's flap, where Winston stood tethered, head lowered, still and calm as ever. She couldn't shake the feeling that the horse had known. Not just about the fall, but something older. Samuel Carow stood beside her, arms crossed, jaw clenched. He had seen many young riders fall, but something about this one unsettled him. Not the injury. Beatrice would ride again, of that he was sure, but the way Winston had behaved. Horses didn't lie down. Not in the middle of an arena. Not with cameras flashing and people screaming. He reacted like, Samuel began, then stopped. Like a person, he'd meant to say. But he wasn't ready to voice that thought aloud. Instead, he cleared his throat and asked, "You all right, lass?" Beatrice nodded faintly, though her lips trembled. "It wasn't just the fall," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When he looked at me, it was like he knew something. Like he was remembering something I couldn't." She paused, staring down at her hands. "I had this image in my head, the day my dad died. I was in the barn. Winston was just a foal. He was staring at the stall door, still and quiet, like today. Samuel didn't answer. He had his own memories of that day, and they didn't add up with the official story either. Later that evening, back at Rosehill Farm, the Langley estate nestled just outside Wiltshire, Beatrice hobbled down the hallway toward the study. Her mother, Margaret, had left for London the day before, attending a teaching seminar. Alone in the quiet house, Beatrice found herself drawn to the one place she had avoided for years, her father's old office. The door creaked as she opened it, dust dancing in the air like spirits disturbed. The room was exactly as he had left it. The same brown leather chair, the cracked globe on the side table, and the heavy oak desk, locked, as always. She reached beneath the desk, fingertips tracing the edge until she found the small brass key taped underneath. Her father had taught her that hiding spot when she was 8, showing her where he kept important things that shouldn't be seen too soon. Her hand trembled as she slid the key into the lock. The desk gave a soft click. Inside, she found yellowed papers, old notebooks, and one small leather-bound journal with her father's initials pressed into the cover, EWL. She froze. Something deep in her chest tightened. She held the book for several seconds before opening it. The first page was blank. The second, too. But on the third page, there it was, a line written in her father's familiar, slanted script. Winston is not just a horse. He remembers. Beatrice stared at the sentence until the ink seemed to blur into the grain of the page. Winston is not just a horse. He remembers. The air in the study felt suddenly heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. She turned the page slowly, heart pounding in her chest. What had her father meant? Horses didn't remember the way people did, not like this. And yet, Winston had looked at her in that arena with something more than instinct, something that felt painfully human. The journal continued, not in orderly entries, but in fragments, thoughts scribbled between diagrams of horse anatomy and bits of poetry. Her father, Edward Langley, had always been a man of science with a poet's soul. One page read, "There are moments when Winston looks at me and I feel as though he's trying to speak. Not with sound, with memory." Another, "He reacts to certain places as though he's been there before." But that's impossible, isn't it? Beatrice's fingers trembled as she read. These weren't notes on training. They were confessions, quiet fears he had never voiced aloud. She turned another page and found a name, Harold Finch. Scribbled beside it, her father had written, "If anything happens to me, he'll know what to do. Ask him about Rosehill, about the day Winston was born." And the others. Others? Beatrice's throat tightened. Were there more horses like Winston? More secrets buried beneath the polite routines of country life and dusty stable doors? She had always assumed her father died from an aneurysm, sudden, tragic, random. But now, she wasn't so sure. Why would a man worried about what might happen write this kind of message? That night, she couldn't sleep. The journal sat open on her bed, the name Harold Finch circled in pencil. She remembered the name faintly, one of her father's old friends, perhaps someone from the early days at Rosehill Farm. She rose just before dawn, pulled on her boots, and slipped out to the stables. Winston was awake, standing silently in his stall, his head rising as she approached. "You knew him," she whispered. "Didn't you?" Winston stepped forward, pressing his warm muzzle gently into her chest. It was the same gesture from the arena, quiet, deliberate. Beatrice rested her forehead against his, her breath shaky. "We're going to find out the truth, you and I," she murmured. "No more hiding. No more guessing." She turned to leave, but as she stepped back, her boot caught on the edge of a floorboard, one that didn't quite sit flush. Curious, she crouched and pried at it. The board lifted with surprising ease. Beneath it, wrapped in old burlap, was a second notebook, much older, and stained in a way that made her stomach tighten. She hadn't just opened a drawer into the past, she'd pulled back a curtain on something far deeper. And this time, she wouldn't be able to close it again. The second notebook was smaller than the first, its leather cover worn and stained, edges frayed with time. It smelled faintly of hay, old paper, and something more metallic, something unsettling. Beatrice sat on a hay bale in the dim light of the stables, her hands slightly trembling as she untied the twine that bound it. The first few pages were written in a different hand, sharper, more rushed than her father's, and dated nearly 16 years ago. At the top of one page, in bold, uneven ink, she saw it, Project Ashmore. She read in silence, each word pulling her further into a reality she hadn't known existed. The notebook wasn't just personal. It was technical, like a field report, scattered with observations, diagrams, and odd language that reminded her of military shorthand. There were mentions of adaptive memory, genetic familiarity, and a recurring phrase, emotional carryover between cycles. Beatrice couldn't make sense of it all, but one thing became clear. Winston, and perhaps other horses like him, had been part of something larger, something secret. And somehow, her father had been involved from the very beginning. A familiar name appeared halfway down the page, Harold Finch, listed as Handler, Initial Conditioning Phase. That confirmed it. Finch hadn't just known about Winston, he'd helped raise him. Maybe even trained him before her father brought the foal home. Her chest tightened with the weight of this new knowledge. Why hadn't her mother ever mentioned any of this? And why had her father hidden this notebook under the floorboards, not in his desk? The choice felt deliberate, as if he'd known that someone, someday, would come looking for answers. Beatrice stood and moved to Winston's stall, the notebook still clutched in her hand. He watched her approach with that same silent calm. "You've been carrying something, haven't you?" she said softly. Something no one else could see. She reached through the bars, running her hand gently down the length of his face. His eyes didn't blink, they only watched her, deeply, as if confirming everything she'd begun to suspect. Whatever Winston had experienced, whatever he remembered, it hadn't ended with her father's death. It was still living in him. At breakfast, Beatrice confronted her mother for the first time in months. "Mom," she said, laying the notebook on the kitchen table, "did Dad ever talk to you about Ashmore? Or a man named Harold Finch?" Margaret froze mid-pour, the tea sloshing slightly over the rim of her cup. The color drained from her face before she composed herself. "No," she said quickly, too quickly. "Why would he?" But her hands told a different story, trembling slightly, unable to steady the cup. Beatrice said nothing, but she noticed every detail. Later that day, Beatrice pulled out her laptop and typed into the search bar, Harold Finch plus Rosehill Farm. Only one result came up, an obituary. Not for Harold, but for his wife. And in the small photo attached to the memorial page, just behind the grieving man, Beatrice saw a young Winston, standing in the background of the funeral. The photograph haunted her. Beatrice stared at the grainy image on the obituary page, her eyes fixed on the background. There, behind the gathered mourners in black, stood Winston, unmistakable. Even then, younger and slimmer, he held the same posture, the same quiet watchfulness. He had been present at the funeral of Harold Finch's wife, nearly a decade before Beatrice ever rode him. But that raised a question too strange to ignore. How had Winston, who was supposedly born at Rosehill 6 years ago, appeared in a photograph dated 10 years prior? She printed the image and tucked it into her coat pocket. There was only one place that might have answers now. Ashmore Village, a remote hamlet about 30 miles west of Wiltshire, nestled at the edge of a forest with the same name. According to the notebook, Ashmore had once been a training site, now long abandoned. Beatrice didn't tell her mother where she was going. Instead, she left a note and took the train at dawn, the journal and both notebooks packed tightly in her satchel. Winston remained at Rose Hill, but she felt his presence as though he were beside her on the empty seat. The village was silent, wrapped in a blanket of mist that made the old cottages and dry stone walls look like relics from another time. Beatrice walked slowly down the main lane until she found the name she was looking for on a rusted mailbox. H. Finch. The cottage behind it was modest, tucked between two leafless oaks. She hesitated at the gate. Her hands were cold, but her resolve was warm and burning. When she knocked, there was a long pause before the door creaked open. Harold Finch was older than she'd expected, at least in his 70s, but sharp-eyed, with a face lined by decades of hard living and silence. He didn't look surprised to see her. "You're Langley's girl," he said flatly, stepping aside. "Come in, then." Beatrice crossed the threshold, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. Inside, the house smelled of tobacco and earth. Faded photographs lined the mantel. Horses, riders, medals, and in several of them, again, Winston. But under different names: Regal, Ash, Barlow. Same eyes. Same horse. "I've been waiting for this day," Finch said quietly, settling into a chair. "Your father knew it would come. He just hoped it wouldn't fall to you." Beatrice sat opposite him, notebook in hand. "I need the truth," she said. "About Winston. About my father. And about whatever they did at Ashmore." Finch took a long breath, then leaned forward. "The truth, girl?" he murmured. "The truth is, Winston's not on his first life." Beatrice froze. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Finch nodded toward the photo she'd brought, the one with Winston at the funeral. "That horse remembers because he's lived it all before." Beatrice stared at Harold Finch, waiting for him to explain what he had just said. Not on his first life? The words sounded like nonsense, or worse, like the kind of ramblings that came with age and solitude. But Harold's eyes were clear. He wasn't confused. He was burdened. "Start from the beginning," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Harold nodded slowly, reached into a drawer beside his armchair, and pulled out a thick envelope, worn at the edges. Inside were old documents, reports, and photos. Some bore government stamps. Others were handwritten in ink so faded it was nearly gone. He laid a photograph on the table. It showed a younger Winston, or a horse exactly like him, in a military training compound, with Edward Langley standing proudly beside him. "Your father was recruited for Ashmore because he had something the rest of U.S. didn't," Harold began. "He could connect with them, the horses. He believed, like I did, that certain animals carried memories stronger than we understood. Not just learned behavior, but something deeper. Emotional memory." Beatrice leaned closer. The horse in the photo had the same white blaze, the same intelligent eyes. "They weren't cloning them," Harold continued. "They weren't trying to build war horses or anything that dramatic. It started with a question. Can memory pass through the body to the soul? What if a horse like Winston had experienced enough trauma, enough connection, that it imprinted?" He paused, watching her reaction. "Winston is one of the few that kept it, that emotional continuity. We called it echoing." Beatrice felt chills rising across her arms. She'd heard her father use that word once, in a dream she thought she'd imagined. Echoing. "But why keep it secret?" she asked. "Why didn't my father tell anyone? Why hide the journals?" Harold's jaw tensed. "Because the project went too far," he said bitterly. "Some wanted to push Winston. Make him remember things no horse should, loud things, violent things. Edward pulled him out before it was too late. Faked the foal's records, brought him to Rose Hill, raised him from scratch. He thought the connection would fade." He looked at her grimly. "It didn't." Beatrice closed her eyes. It all made sense now. Winston's eyes, the way he moved, the weight he carried. Harold reached for a final envelope, sealed and marked with her father's initials, EWL. "He left this with me in case you ever came looking," he said. Beatrice's fingers trembled as she took it. The envelope was thick, heavier than expected. She turned it over. The seal cracked. Inside, she found a letter and a map. A red circle drawn deep in Ashmore Forest, marked only with 2 words, "Final Memory." Beatrice looked up. "What's out there?" she asked. Harold didn't blink. "The last place Winston remembers, and the place your father never dared return to." The wind shifted as Beatrice stepped beyond the tree line of Ashmore Forest, the map gripped tightly in her gloved hands. The circle her father had drawn was deep within the old woodland, far from the bridle paths, far from where anyone rode or walked anymore. The air smelled of damp earth and moss, and the canopy above her head thickened with every step. She had left Winston in Harold's care back in the village, but already she felt the pull of him, like a thread from her chest stretching toward something unresolved. Her boots sank slightly into the soft undergrowth as she followed the markings on the map, noting faded landmarks. A fallen oak, a crumbling stone wall, the remnants of an old path long overtaken by roots. It was quiet. Not peaceful, eerily quiet, like the forest itself was holding something. As she moved deeper, her thoughts circled around her father. Had he walked this same path, heart-pounding just like hers? What had he seen that he never dared speak of again? And what had Winston carried from this place for so many years? After nearly an hour, she reached the clearing, the center of the red circle. It was more than just a patch of grass. It was scorched. The ground was blackened in places. The remnants of old wooden fencing lay splintered and half-buried in soil. In the middle stood a rusted metal post, broken at the top, surrounded by shattered glass and fragments of leather harness. She knelt, picking up a small medallion, military issue, engraved with the initials EL. Her father had been here. But something had gone terribly wrong. Images crashed into her mind like waves. Horses rearing, shouting, fire, sirens. Her breath caught, and she stumbled backward. The sensation was overwhelming, like a memory not her own had suddenly erupted inside her. She touched her chest, trying to steady herself. "This isn't mine," she thought. "This belongs to Winston." But somehow, through their years together, through every fall and brush and breath, it had passed into her. She was beginning to understand what her father meant by emotional carryover. Suddenly, she heard something behind her, a soft exhale, the unmistakable sound of hooves stepping over fallen branches. She turned. Winston was there. He had followed her. Not with a lead or rider, but on his own. His eyes found hers across the clearing, and for the first time, she saw it clearly. Grief. Deep, wordless grief, the kind that had lived inside her all these years. And then Winston moved, slowly, deliberately, to the center of the clearing. He lowered his head, and began to paw at the earth. Winston's hoof struck the earth again, more forcefully this time. Beatrice stood frozen, watching as he scraped at the blackened soil, nostrils flaring, tail flicking with tension. There was something desperate about his movements, as if he wasn't just digging, but uncovering. Beatrice moved toward him, heart hammering, and dropped to her knees beside him. "What are you trying to show me?" she whispered. The soil was loose, disturbed. She began to dig with her hands, ignoring the dirt beneath her nails, the cold that bit at her fingertips. Only a few inches down, her fingers struck something solid. Metal. Rusted and curved. She cleared more dirt, revealing a small, twisted fragment of a bridle, still bearing the embossed logo of the Ashmore program. Just beside it lay a weathered leather pouch. Beatrice pulled it out carefully, brushing away decades of dirt and ash. Inside were several photographs, warped by time and moisture. One showed her father, standing in this very clearing, holding a young Winston by the reins. But the next image stole the breath from her lungs. It showed another horse, identical to Winston, but injured and tranquilized. The back of the photo was dated 15 years ago, long before Winston was supposedly born. And then, a name she hadn't seen before, Barlow, Cycle 3. Her father hadn't just rescued Winston from the program. Winston was the last of several cycles, each one a continuation of the last, carrying memory, trauma, and experience. The truth wasn't just that he remembered. It was that he had been reborn, again and again, into the same body, the same eyes. She looked up at him, now silent beside her. "You've lived through all of this," she said, her voice cracking. "Haven't you?" Winston lowered his head, gently brushing her shoulder with his muzzle. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't instinct. It was something older, something sacred. She suddenly understood the weight he had carried, the moments when he seemed to hesitate during training, or spook at places no other horse reacted to. Every hesitation had been a memory. Every pause, a reminder. And yet, he had trusted her. He had come back to her. Again. Beatrice felt tears begin to well up, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming burden of truth finally seen. The wind stirred, lifting the edge of the map that had fallen from her pocket. The red circle was only one of 3 marked zones. In the lower margin, her father had written something she hadn't noticed before. "Winston's memory ends here, but mine doesn't." It wasn't over. There was still more to uncover, not just about the program, but about what her father had done after it all ended. Beatrice rose to her feet, her hands dirty, her eyes shining. Winston stood beside her, calm again. Together, they looked toward the forest, toward whatever waited in the next clearing. The sky had turned gray by the time Beatrice and Winston reached the second red circle on the map. The forest here was different. Older, denser, with twisted roots and leaning trees that creaked softly in the wind. It felt untouched by time. Winston moved with caution, his ears flicking back and forth. He remembered this place too. Beatrice could feel it in the tension of his steps, in the way he stopped every few yards to listen. She held the map tightly, but her sense of direction came more from him now than from any drawing. They reached a low ridge where moss-covered stones formed a partial wall, the remains of a shelter long collapsed. In its center stood a stone pedestal, weather-worn and cracked, with rusted bolts jutting from its top. It looked like a foundation. For what, she couldn't tell. Near its base, buried beneath leaves and dirt, she found another pouch, identical to the one in the clearing. Inside was a bundle of letters wrapped in wax paper. The topmost envelope was addressed in her father's handwriting, "To my daughter, if she ever dares to ask." Her hands shook as she unfolded the first letter. Edward Langley's words spilled across the page in ink that had faded but not disappeared. "Beatrice, I knew one day you'd come looking. I didn't want you to. I prayed Winston's memories would fade with time, but they didn't, and I see now they never will. He was never just a horse. He was my companion, my test, my guilt, and my redemption." She read every line slowly, absorbing the grief and love woven into each word. Her father hadn't run from the program. He had tried to bury it, but he had never escaped it. The second letter was shorter, more urgent. It spoke of another man, a Dr. Emery Quill, a scientist who had overseen the Ashmore experiments and who had opposed Edward's decision to shut them down. He wanted to push further, the letter read. He believed memory could be weaponized, even in animals. The last known location of Quill was the third red circle. Beatrice's eyes shifted to it on the map. Ashmore Lodge, an estate listed as abandoned, deeper in the woods. Beatrice folded the letters and looked at Winston. "There's one more place," she said softly. "One more piece of your story, and his." Winston exhaled, almost like a sigh, and nudged her gently toward the path. They moved forward together, the forest growing darker around them. With every step, Beatrice felt herself shedding the skin of a daughter and stepping into something else, a guardian of a story too long buried. They didn't speak. They just walked toward the final memory, and whatever truth still waited to be found. The path to Ashmore Lodge was overgrown, almost completely reclaimed by the forest. Ivy strangled the wrought iron gates, and shattered glass crunched beneath Beatrice's boots as she stepped through what remained of the entryway. Winston followed her without hesitation, ears alert, his steps measured. The building had once been grand, a hunting estate converted into a research outpost. Now it stood in silent ruin, a skeleton of brick and timber. Beatrice felt the weight of history pressing down on her chest, not just her family's, but something much larger. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Dust floated like ash in the filtered light. She moved room to room, guided by the last coordinates on her father's map. In a locked drawer behind a broken desk, she found it, a sealed metal case labeled Cycle Continuity Logs, Confidential. Inside were files, faded negatives, and a final letter, this one from Dr. Emery Quill. It was dated just 2 days before her father's death. The note was brief, but devastating. You were right to pull him out. But it's too late. The connection is irreversible. If you've kept Winston, be warned, he remembers everything, including the fire. Beatrice's hands trembled. The fire. She turned the note over. There was a small photo attached, a barn engulfed in flames. In the corner, a silhouette of a horse, trapped, panicking. And standing outside, barely visible through the smoke, a man, her father. This was it. The moment Winston had never let go of. The trauma that had embedded itself into every muscle, every twitch, every glance. And her father had never forgiven himself. Not for what he allowed, not for what Winston endured. She walked back out to the clearing behind the lodge where the foundation of the old barn still remained, now choked with weeds. Winston stopped at the edge, his body suddenly still. Beatrice watched as he lowered his head and stepped forward, not with fear, but release. She followed him, crouched beside the old stones and whispered, "It's over. You're safe." He forgave himself. And so can you. Winston closed his eyes. The wind shifted. A single leaf drifted past them, slow and soft like a final breath. That evening, they returned to Rose Hill Farm. The sun dipped low, casting golden light across the paddocks. Beatrice stood at the gate while Winston grazed peacefully nearby. She held the last of her father's letters in her hand, unopened. But she didn't need to read it. She understood now. Her father hadn't just saved Winston. He had trusted her to carry the truth forward, not with science or files, but with compassion. Winston looked up, his eyes meeting hers. And in that moment, Beatrice felt no weight, no fear, only clarity. The story wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what came next. And this time, they'd write it together.